Hello and welcome to a book discussion on a very, very interesting book written by a Dutch journalist, investigative journalist, Bette Dam. This is her second book. And this is a book which actually, breaks a lot of the normal conventional things which we have been told about Afghanistan. It breaks new ground for many people because the author has traveled in areas which many of us probably would never dare to, and she comes out with a fascinating piece of work which is invaluable for anybody who works on Afghanistan, wants to understand Afghanistan. So welcome, Bette Dam, and thank you for giving us time to come and speak about your book. And we have a fabulous panel on this show. We have Anju Gupta, who is an IPS officer and who has written extensively on terrorism in Indian newspapers. She has also worked, for the UN Development Fund for Women. And the International Organization of Migration. We have Nayanama Basu, who's the diplomatic editor for the print, and she covers foreign policy and strategic issues. But more importantly, last year when the Afghan government was falling and the Taliban were marching through Afghanistan, Nayanama was one of the few intrepid Indian journalists who had gone and covered Afghanistan from ground zero. And frankly, when the fall was coming, she was there, and one did feel a little concerned and hoped that she would remain safe. And if I mistake not, she was on that flight which evacuated the Indian mission out of Kabul, and that's another story. And maybe we should have her over to just give details of that particular story. And finally, we have Dr. Priyanka Singh, who's an associate fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Priyanka has worked on Pakistan. She has been working on Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, and she has also worked on the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So all the speakers eminently qualified to discuss Bette Dam's book. And I'll first request Bette Dam to, just give a broad overview of her book, the challenges she faced, and of course, the new ground which she has broken in this book. So the floor is all yours, Bette Dam.
Thank you, Sushant. Sorry for not unmuting. Thank you for your enthusiasm. Thank you for everybody to be here and to discuss the book. It's a 5-year research that has now been published in English. And I think what you said was really nice. Why has this book so many insights that we didn't know, that I also didn't know before I started? And that is, I think, like you said, is that the maybe a little bit unfortunate thing that I, and not because I want to tap myself on the shoulder, but there are, I think, just not enough journalists trying to go outside of the city. Or in Afghanistan, in the case of Afghanistan, Western journalists trying to leave the military camps. And there's been predominantly a coverage on the American troops from American journalists, so to say. And so that's what I did, is like leave them behind and just write the story, in this case, the story of the Taliban, by going to their villages and traveling and also using the access that was there. I mean, I travel in the South a lot. It might still feel like I have been doing very dangerous research trips. I don't think so, and I'm very scared easily. It's not that I'm a bungee jumper or I do love difficult sports. Not at all. I hope that's also coming across in the book a little bit, that despite the fact that there is the war on terror in Afghanistan, which came from a frame that came from Washington, D.C., I was much more seeing hospitality in Afghanistan and a will to tell the story. Afghans were the perfect guides to bring me to the places I wanted to go to. And that resulted in this book. Yeah.
So it's very interesting what you say about, the kind of access that was available to you, because that's been my experience traveling in Pakistan, that access was never a problem. You had to be careful in many occasions, but access was never a problem. And even, the most despicable people were ready to meet you, and also were quite hospitable, I must add. So, that's true. But, perhaps sitting far away and looking at Afghanistan and all the horror stories, which are published in the international media, I guess it does create a climate of fear and distrust. But I think what I found extremely interesting, and it's something which many people in India have been feeling for a fair bit of time, is the kind of parachute journalism that is so prevalent in the Western media. That people not going into the depth of the story, people not trying to peel off the layers of a story, people basically regurgitating what is being told to them, either by the units in which they are embedded, or just repeating or parroting the stories given to them by the armies from the countries they come from.
Yeah,
I suspect that one of the big problems in Afghanistan, and which you very correctly mentioned in your book, was that very telescopic kind of view Western media took. And I found that insight into your take on the Western media extremely important, because we sense the kind of ignorance with which Western media very often reports stories from India. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that particular aspect of how Afghanistan ultimately played out, and the mistakes that were made in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So basically, the book has two stories. Basically, the story of the Taliban leader, and the story of the Taliban shows at the same time the second layer in the book that has to do with what we thought we knew, and what the interviewees basically, who most of them had never given an interview to a Westerner, for example, which is a shame because they were all willing to. And so that story. So basically you see that there is the frame of like the Taliban that is a monster. You cannot talk to them. They will never, ever have any place for female in their society. They basically are everything, like George Bush said after 9/11, they are everything we do not stand for. And so very black and white, very much an enemy, creating an enemy in this war on terror frame. And that has been basically the reason why America lost, I think, because they were fundamentalist in believing this narrative. They really were almost religious in it, and not willing to be more complex, to think more complex, to really elevate the Afghan voice in their research. The Afghan voice in the American reports is sometimes present, but not dominant. But if it is present, it tells the same story as the Americans do. And that's a problem. It's a big problem. It's colonialism almost in our reporting, in the government reporting, also at the EU, also at the UN. Anyway, if you put that aside and you basically do elevate the Afghan voice, then this is the result. My book is the result. The result is that we do deal with a very Afghan movement, in the case of the Taliban, not a movement that, for example, the leaders of the Taliban were raised in Pakistan in angry madrasas, shouting Allahu Akbar, and never ever wanted to deal anywhere with the West. That is the picture I got before from Al Jazeera, I named them in the book. Well, we see, if we go to their schools, we don't need to go to Pakistan for the first generation of the Taliban. We have to go to very unknown education system that not anybody had heard from before. This Hujra system, where there was an apolitical curriculum, for example. It was not done to talk about politics. Politics was dirty. You have to talk about Islam and the rules, how to live. And there you see the first contour of how Mullah Omar, the leaders of the Taliban, are seeing the world. It's a very small world. There's many people in Mullah Omar's surroundings who still think that the earth is flat, that if they continue walking and that they fall off the earth. But also their idea of how should the society look like? How should you behave as a Muslim? Very, very practical, have a long beard, look nice, be nice to your neighbors, friends, and family. And I mention all these sort of life rules, right? And you see that's a part of Afghanistan that is very present in all these villages. I mean, Sushant, wherever I traveled, there were these tiny mosques with these tiny, tiny little schools where the Taliban, until when I left in 2019, they were still there. They were still teaching the same stuff. There's a massive, massive amount of students that we do not talk to. That have a very presence in the country and that have important stories to tell besides the elite in Kabul. And so we see a story that also is not anti-Western. That is also interesting. Is that the right term, anti-Western? I guess it means that Mullah Omar actually turned out to be a person, when he came into power, who wanted to work with the West. He actually had a bond in his mind with the US because the US was so helpful in this jihad against the Russians and against the communists. And you see from the beginning, and you see the Taliban 1994, they take over. And then you see that this movement who comes with very strict rules, with very strict life rules, with very conservative, uber-conservative idea about women, that comes to power because the country is destroyed at that time. And that destruction, the Americans have a role in too. And there is no, there's nothing else than local groups that find each other to rise to power. That is a little bit of in the first part of the Taliban. That is a bit of a different narrative, I think. Then there is, of course, the rise of Mullah Omar. Why did he become the leader with the influence of the mafia, the Afghan mafia, so to say, the drugs leaders? There were many at the time. Because of the destruction in the war, it was very profitable to have fields full of opium. And I find that also a very pragmatic story again, okay, the country is in shambles, the economy is dying, our business is under threat, we need to fix this. And then I describe how this drugs mafia makes their way to Mullah Omar, which is very important to understand his rise to power, I think. And I think then the relationship with Osama bin Laden is also much more complex. It's not a love relationship like the Americans really want us to believe. it's a very complex relationship where Mullah Omar didn't really want him to be in the country. And at the same time, there is a political crisis where the Americans do not want to work with the Taliban. And that you see that again today. And that frustrates Mullah Omar and his leadership. And on the point of Osama bin Laden, it is not an ideologically embracement of the jihad Osama bin Laden wants to do, the international jihad, at all. Mullah Omar is against that. He has an Afghan policy. He wants to rebuild the country in his way. And tries to get rid of him, but he doesn't do it in the end. Is that Pashtunwali? I don't know. Is that the political crisis? Yes, I think it's a total distrust in the end between the US and the Taliban. I find it so difficult to summarize this book, but I hope it makes sense a little bit. I mean, there's so many things actually happening. But for me, maybe the last point, then we have to go and open the discussion. But what is for me, and maybe for the reader, the most important thing to know is that after 9/11, you do see that the leadership of Mullah Omar and the Taliban do basically make a move towards the new regime that is under the leadership of Hamid Karzai and the Americans. And that is the surrender. That means that big leaders of the Taliban do not want to fight anymore. We see, and that is extremely important to understand Afghanistan, we see that this peace offer, that this, Afghan peace, an Afghan peace deal is basically destroyed by the Americans because they cannot believe that you can talk to the Taliban. They cannot believe it. The people in America told me, but the Twin Towers were still burning. How can we talk to the Taliban? And that's a complete misunderstanding of the movement. And so with that local peace deal, you see that Hamid Karzai, the then president, has to go alone basically to Kabul to lead the country. And then the Americans live with the idea that the Taliban is everywhere, that the Taliban has to be killed. And they sent more troops. And so what you need to know is that basically in the first 5 years of Afghanistan after 9/11, the Americans have sent troops to a country without an enemy. And that is extremely important to understand. Who did they kill in these first 5 years? They killed rivals of governors. They killed personal family feuds. They killed people who were fighting over drugs fields because the allies, the Afghan government that became the allies of the Americans got the freedom to pinpoint to an enemy. The Americans flew in and said, "Where is the Taliban? Tell it to us." And then they pointed at a valley like in Uruzgan, in Mirabat, for example, again and again. And it was a rivalry between the new governor and his family. And so there were a lot of unnecessary killings. And there was no war, basically. There was no war on terror anymore in Afghanistan. And the Americans were not able to see that. And that led to the return of the Taliban, because any country where you send troops that is going to kill innocent people is going to result in chaos and the uprising of the most conservative movements. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Anju Gupta, if I can just come to you, you've written a lot on Afghanistan. You've written a lot on terrorism, on extremism, radicalism. You've worked on that issue, and not just at a theoretical level, but also at a practical. And I'm sure you know. I'm sure. I know that you've been looking at Afghanistan very closely. So a lot of the narrative in the book is kind of it breaks some of the old frameworks under which we've been operating. And yet, the reality was also that while the relationship might not have been very friendly between Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar, or between the Taliban and the Al Qaeda cadre, and Bette Dam does write about that in her book, that there were these tensions, and the Arabs would look upon the Afghans with some degree of contempt. And yet we saw that, over the period of time, over the last 20 odd years, the Taliban have never really broken their links with any of the other terrorist groups, whether it was the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Al Qaeda, you name the group, they have been, in a sense, hand in glove with them, at least at an operational level. So, in your view, how would you, kind of balance out the narrative in the book to what people like you, me, and other people who study terrorism for a living have been watching and observing as far as Afghanistan is concerned? Where do you see a connection or a disconnect? What?
Thank you so much, Mr. Sari. Good afternoon to you all. It's really a very fascinating book. The author has really spent so much time on the ground, going to these back of beyond villages. And I agree with Mr. Sarin, we would have loved to see the pictures because they tell you more stories. So very interesting insights you brought out, Bette Dam, and marvelous piece of hard work. The relevant part of the history of Afghanistan closer to the 1979 Soviet invasion is very well captured, and so is the withdrawal and the aftermath of this, which is really the civil war. And on a lighter side, it just struck me when I was reading through that book. I've read the whole book in the last 3 days. Taliban at that point in time was facing the same crisis that they're facing today. Lack of resources, no recognition, humanitarian crisis, talent deficit, amazing. I think the history repeats itself. The book quite correctly mentions, how foreign fighters were brought in to this theater in the name of First Afghan Jihad by the US and allies, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, UAE. And, how this all played out. It also documents quite correctly that many of the foreign fighters actually went back with the legacy of jihad. And that is how we see that from there we see the emergence of groups in the Arab world, in North Africa, in Southeast Asia. So really the first Afghan jihad is the one that actually sent out these germs of jihad all over in terms of pure, the kind of terrorism that we see today. But your book also notes very categorically that many foreign fighters were actually, they actually stayed back in the camps run by Osama bin Laden in Pakistan and also in Afghanistan. So that's something that we should not lose sight of if we are looking at the question of terrorism and the links of Taliban with those groups, something that Mr. Sareen asked me to speak about. Anyway, so many of the details about Mullah Omar's background and roles that he played match with what is known. However, there is some variance. In fact, I would say riddles that I would like to point out. There are 6 aspects to the pen picture of Mullah Omar. And these is what was his standing in the first Afghan jihad against the USSR? What was his role amongst warring mujahideen during the civil war? Birth of Taliban movement, how he became the leader, and the Amirul Mominin, which is something very, very significant. This whole concept of Amirul Mominin is very significant. And what was his connection to Osama, and if he had any role in 9/11. So yes, Mullah Omar, as you captured, was a small-time fighter in the jihad against USSR. He was not a big-time commander. He was also not a big-time mullah to begin with. You've captured this. The book doubts whether he studied in jihadi madrasa in Pakistan. I think this is a point of debate. There's been a lot of evidence to the contrary, and I'm not talking about Western media here. Of course, he did not, to begin with, he didn't have a big role amongst the warring Mujahideens, the Pashtun commanders of southern Afghanistan, Kandahar, Greater Kandahar area, as we call it. So he became a sort of a leader of a small pack of friends, and then they became the Taliban, and the Taliban drew cadres from the Mujahideen and the students from the madrasas of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, all this is again very well settled, that these talibs, these student, talib means student, came from these madrasas that had been funded with the money that came for Mujahideen against this first jihad against the Soviets. Now, my tricky thing is when and how and by whom this small time Mullah Omar, who didn't have super credentials as a fighter, becomes the leader of the Taliban movement. Mind you, it is one of the biggest movements, right? And Amirul Mominin. Now, Amirul Mominin is something that we can probably discuss a little later. I want to quickly finish the points that I have culled out of this book. Now, the point to ponder is, on his own, Mullah Omar didn't have the aura, he didn't have resources, he didn't have the muscle to play that role of leading a small bunch of his friends to such a big victory that he was set out to capture Kandahar. And mind you, if I'm sure you must have seen it there, the way Afghanistan operates, these tribal leaders, these strong men are very important. And you had somebody like Gul Aga Sherzai as the governor of Kandahar. You had Mullah Rabbani, he had Hikmat Yar. Now, Mullah Omar had no such standing in a feudal Pashtun society at that point in time. They didn't challenge him. And they didn't challenge him becoming Amirul Mominin, which is much more sacred a concept in Islam. So what gave him that power and aura? To the extent that he became the leader of Afghanistan in 1996. It's something that needs to be asked and to be questioned and to be pondered over. Second is about the timing of him becoming Amirul Mominin. Now, the timing here again doesn't match. In April 1996, if he becomes Amirul Mominin, by September, I think they've taken over Kabul. A few months. Now, within few months, logistically, it is not possible to score that kind of a victory. And Kabul, it was not easy. So, what we really know is what has really come out, and there's a lot of credible evidence in the open source, is that it is the Pakistani deep state, you may disagree, which cobbled together Taliban to unite the warring Pashtun commander. And they had Mullah Omar as a known and a reliable person. Then myths were built around him, person of faith, he sacrificed his eye for jihad. He was not a self-seeker commander, unlike other commanders. And it is the Pakistan ISI that got together and got him declared as Amirul Mominin in 1994.
I would not agree with that.
Okay, let me just finish. I said, I think it's going to be an interesting. I just tell you something that, we've, and I'm not referring to the Western narrative here. Now, see, Al-Qaeda was already having a free run in Pakistan. As you yourself said, that Osama bin Laden was paying for these foreign fighters staying in 4 guest houses in Pakistan. Now, please, what is important is that narrative of a jihad was built to chase the Soviets out. And what was the jihad? What was the first jihad, the narrative? That godless Russia, godless USSR, which was trying to capture an Islamic land, to save an Islamic land from godless USSR, first jihad, had very clear narrative. But now USSR was out, Pashtun commanders were warring, and they guard their fiefdom with their lives, and they're willing to fight for it. So now there was a new dramatic narrative that was needed. And that dramatic narrative was that now you needed pure Islamic rule under an Amirul Mominin. And that is the reason why Mullah Omar was named as the Amirul Mominin. I think in the history of South Asia, Middle East is different. I don't recall, correct me if I'm wrong, that anybody has ever declared somebody to be Amirul Momin. Maybe Muhammad bin Tughlaq. I'm not a student of history, but it is something so, out of the ordinary. Second jihad against had to be redefined so that somehow the power could be captured. And it could only happen with this Amirul Momin. Mullah Omar on his own didn't have the capacity or the influence to make it happen, that he becomes Amirul Momin. Now, it's very important to understand that Al-Qaeda played a very important role. And I'll give you very specific instances of what happened. Al-Qaeda had stayed back after the first Afghan jihad. USSR left, Americans left, but Al-Qaeda was there. And it hasn't left AFPAC since then. And Afghanistan became a crucible for the larger jihad that Al-Qaeda wanted to wage against the Islamic rules and the Western countries that were supporting them. Al-Qaeda had the ideology, it had money, it had foreign fighters, it had friends in the Arab world. What it needed was a legitimate government where it could find shelter and support. The cadres had been expelled, from Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Sudan, but Afghanistan was there for Al-Qaeda to make it happen also. Because Al-Qaeda needed big ticket attacks to actually become the big daddy of international terrorism. And that's exactly what happened during Taliban rule. I will give you 4 examples. 1998, 2 US embassies were bombed in Tanzania and in Kenya. 1999, an Indian airline 814 was hijacked from Kathmandu, and it goes all over. And where does it land? It lands in Kandahar with over 200 Indians on board. And who came to receive them? Mullah Omar, the second Amirul Momin. And there were a whole lot of other guys. And these were Jaish-e-Mohammed terrorist. Third, bombing of USS Cole, 2000. And then Twin Tower bombing, 9/11. 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001. Please look at the sequence. Where was the source of all these? These are big ticket attacks.
This means, can I interrupt? Because I feel like there is indeed this narrative that you are producing now. And I think the debate here is also about this book has been trying to give another narrative. And it's, if I hear you like this, then you say, I don't believe the book, basically. I think the book on the rise to power of Mullah Omar with the role of the drug mafia, or the way they captured Kabul, the appointment of the Amir Mominin, which was a very local, national decision in relation to their conflict with the fighters in the north, the fighters under Ahmed Shah Massoud. It was not, the title is very big, but it was used for a very local problem. And I think the relationship between Al-Qaeda and Taliban was not so massive and close. And so, yeah, I feel like that is what I try to do, and what I find important to basically now, 2022, to basically see if we can complexify this narrative. And that is the goal. And I feel that this is, important, that the Taliban, their relationship with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda itself, who were they? What was Osama bin Laden doing? What was his real power? These things, I think we need to re-question it again.
Okay, so
Priyanka, can I just go to Priyanka? Priyanka, something that Bette Dam said in response to one of the questions I put to her has been striking me. She said it was the fundamentalism of the Americans who refused to recognize some of the other realities of Afghanistan. In a sense, do you think it was a clash of two fundamentalisms that we were witnessing in Afghanistan, which prevented any kind of middle ground? Because even when the Americans started backing down on their fundamentalism and were open to negotiations, the Taliban found no reason to talk to them. And there was a time when the Americans were riding very high and they found no reason to talk to the Taliban. But just as an aside, two things. One, Anju, what you said about Mullah Omar, I'll just add that as an aside before I go to Priyanka. So Priyanka can just think about the question I put. Saw this in Pakistan, how the tribal system, the tribal hierarchical system actually got broken down because of the kind of tumult that was taking place in these regions. It was still the tribal structure, but that hierarchy had broken down. It was still the same tribes, the dynamics of the tribes were the same, but the hierarchical structure of the Maliks and the Khans and others had broken. At least in Pakistan, we saw that. And I'm sure it's something similar must have happened in Afghanistan, because when you look at the example of, I forget the name of the guy, Haji something in Nangarhar, where he became the biggest warlord out there, and all the other big Khans and Maliks and others would kowtow to the guy. So we've seen that happen. So if in the case of Umar, he suddenly found larger acceptance, I don't think that is so much out of the ordinary. That does not mean that the Pakistanis were not involved. That does not mean that they were not backing this guy completely. That does not mean that they were not putting in their military personnel and all sorts of other resources behind them. That is all, of course, very well documented. But the rise of the guy is not so extraordinary. But Priyanka, the clash of two fundamentalisms.
Yes. Thank you, Chair, and thanks, ORF, for inviting me. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be sharing the dais with this panel. Before I come to the question, I just would like to say that I think Betty's book is very opportune. It comes at a very opportune time. It could not be timelier than this. I think when the Dutch version came in 2019, it was a very critical juncture in Afghanistan's history because the world was still grappling with the reality that the Americans were kind of willing or sitting across the negotiating table with the Taliban. And now when it is republished today, we are still and especially if you look at it, the situation from the Western, the United States prism per se, things have really gone awry. So I think it comes at a very, it's very well timed in that sense. Now, I'll just make some broad observations. I think the chair has put it very beautifully. I think it is indeed some kind of clash between two fundamentalism. And in that sense, I feel this book has touched some raw nerves. And why I say so, because this entire paradigm of this war on terror, I mean, where did it go? Who benefited, and how and when the enemy kind of transformed from the Al-Qaeda to the Taliban, the descendants of the same Mujahideen, which was a key ally of the West a few decades ago. Now, who's the real enemy for that matter? All these questions, which side of the aisle was Pakistan on, and whether the US kind of oversaw or sort of accepted Pakistani affinities in that sense. How did this tandem work in Afghanistan all these years? And then Osama was found in Abbottabad. Mullah Omar died in Karachi. So was the US kind of really so oblivious of these interlinkages that were there and kind of the fraternalism that was existing? So in that sense, I think we also have to look at what targets did this war achieve. I mean, the US-led war on terror. Because I remember a former defense secretary of the United States, Donald Rumsfeld, I mean, way back in 2003, he declared that the major combat was over in Afghanistan. And I remember the then US Central Command chief, along with Hamid Karzai, they declared around that time, and I quote, that we are at a point that we clearly have moved from major combat activity to a period of stability and stabilization and reconstruction and activities. So some kind of transition from combat to reconstruction, I think they were referring to then. So what took so long for the US to kind of vacate Afghanistan? I mean, that is one question we really need to look at. And you may remember before President Trump, he lost elections in 2020. In September 2020, I think he created some kind of a controversy when he pointed out as to how the Pentagon generals were kind of, they were they were interested in waging wars just to kind of benefit the defense industry, their defense manufacturing industry. So I think these are questions that really need deeper probe and a serious probe in that sense, and a critical, unbiased sort of an assessment. And I feel Betty's work is a step in that particular direction, because as the punchline of the book, it has been that she's still looking for answers and rebuttals. I think that debate really needs to be taken up very seriously, that side. If I can just point out to the other, just one point which is very kind of remarkable in the book, and I would call it another raw nerve that Betty's work has really dwelt upon, is to do with the war reporting. And I kind of drive this point particularly from Betty's TED Talk, which I kind of really just partially I just listened to it, and where she was talking about the ethics of war journalism, and how by not doing some kind of, I think you said neutral, how by not doing neutral reporting, journalism was actually promoting war. So I think that's a very, very pertinent point that we really need to look at. I think the chair also referred to it in his opening remarks. I think that that's something which lies at the core of this narrative building that we are talking about, how are war narratives kind of constructed, and how circumstances and journalists' own discretion kind of color the narrative that we hear and we read. So of course, and I remember you also said something very interesting about how these journalists were being housed at the US bases with the US soldiers all around. So I mean, these are things which we really need to kind of take into consideration while kind of accepting or rejecting narratives, and kind of really having a balanced view of the state of affairs there. But in that sense, I think you have really managed that kind of a dilemma, because dilemma very well in your book in that sense, because we would all agree that war reporting is important, but it is also at the same time, I mean, you have to shield yourself, because you cannot, I mean, one would not like to put your life in danger and kind of really just kind of go nowhere in that sense. So we would all agree that war reporting is very important, and because that is something which tells everyone else around the world, I mean, what is actually happening on the ground. I think for the time being, I'll just end here and come back in there.
It's a fabulous note on which to go to Nayanima, because she was covering the war when a lot of us were sitting comfortably in front of our television screens and watching what was happening. And that was a tough time, because frankly, I don't think anybody really expected the collapse to happen as soon as it did. And since you were there, Nayanima, two things. One, on the questions which both Betty has raised, as well as what Priyanka has spoken about, which completely relates to your profession right now. Betty has, of course, moved on. She's gone into academics, so she's okay. But still to active journalism, and you've done this war reporting. So one is that, and second, you've been there. What is your assessment? What was your instinct? What was your sense of what is likely to happen going forward in Afghanistan, especially in the backdrop of, some of the analysis which has come out in Betty's book?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Sarin. It's an honor to be speaking in ORF, and also with such a fantastic panel. And of course, I mean, I've read Betty's book. I just did an interview with her for the print. But yes, I think the points that have been discussed here, I'll simply speak from the perspective of a journalist. I'm not an expert on this, but having covered foreign policy for so many years, and the fact that, when the peace deal sort of happened between US and the Taliban, there was so much of optimism going around, and also the parallel talks that was going on, the intra-government talks. And we were also being completely sort of being, I would say, getting information from the government to some extent, what India is planning to do. But I believe I mean, for me personally, I took the decision to go there because I was sort of getting fed up to constantly say that, oh, yes, today New York Times has reported that Kabul will fall. No, tomorrow Washington Post is saying it will not fall. And in between, we are constantly, and for India, I think as an Indian journalist, I can say that resources and lack of resources is always a sort of handicap that we have. Unlike the Western media, which I've seen are, hugely supported not by the organization, but also overall, right? And also, of course, from the monetary perspective, when you're going to a war zone, you definitely don't have a budget. You don't know where you'll be ending up. So all those things matter a lot when you send a journalist. And I was grateful that my organization took that initiative and trusted in me. But then when I reached there, I literally realized, and before that, yes, of course, I was covering that India is shutting down its consulate. It first started with Herat. And finally, when I was about to go there in July, we shut down Kandahar. Then when I was there, Mazar-e-Sharif consulate was also shut down. And then we were, in a way, we were getting the information that these are all temporary shutdown, nothing to worry about. So it's just, precautionary measures that we are taking. But when I reached there, I realized that, how much of a difference that you have when you're sitting in Delhi and reporting, and we're actually on the ground. Also, when you're on the ground, you can't just be sitting in Kabul and talking to a few experts out there who are, I'm sorry to say, but they are sort of made up as props who will only speak to the media. And they'll constantly give you the same rhetoric that you constantly hear from them. You need to speak to the common man, to the women, to the children, to those little babies who have been, they were born in a war zone. They know what it is, and we can't even think of the things that they have seen at such a young age. So my first thing was that, yes, I'll be going to Kabul. And then, of course, I went to Mazar-e-Sharif to understand what exactly it is, because Afghanistan lives in all those provinces. It is just not that, in a fancy hotel in Kabul, you can stay and you can constantly report. That's really what I did not want to do. And that is the best part in Bette's book. Also, you can feel the flavor of the soil there, the way people talk, how they approach you, how friendly or unfriendly that they are. And end of the day, for every journalist, it is important to understand that you are in a war zone where you can't even expect, so-called niceties that you get from people otherwise. You may have a cab driver, at least that has happened in my case, who will just, out of just sheer fear will tell you, okay, get out of my cab and you can do whatever you feel like. So that has happened with me, the Sunday on 15th of August, when Taliban was coming over, there was this thing that, I was, and incidentally, I was interviewing that day Gulbuddin Hikmatyar. I was sitting in his residence in his small office doing the interview, and he had this huge setup of a studio, which I was not aware of, because I was alone. I had no camera person who got the visa, who did not get the visa. So unfortunately, I was all alone. Do I believe that, sometimes when you're put in that kind of a situation, the best comes out of you. And then, of course, when I was coming back from his residence, I realized that the city is gone. Because that was an early morning interview that I had. And by the time I came out doing the interview, it was afternoon. And I went on the road and I saw Kabul has come to a complete standstill. But then again, I would say for all the 10, 12 days that I was there, it is very wrong to understand and also to read the Western media constantly to see that, okay, suddenly as if the gates opened and the Taliban came rushing in. The Taliban was very much there. You could feel their presence in Mazar-e-Sharif. You could feel their presence in Kabul. You could even feel their presence in the Serena hotel that I was leaving. And, you would know that they are there. They are surrounding you. These invisible eyes are all there. They were in kind of, I would say like slipper cells. And then they just came out one fine day. So to say that they suddenly came out and, they took over forcefully, it was all being worked out. as the withdrawal was also happening, and at least that's the assessment I got. And the assessment that I also got is that the withdrawal, we call it chaotic. I think that was always the plan, was that let's just leave Afghanistan in a chaos and let them just decide what they want to do, because our war is over. So, and now when we talk about the fact, now when the UN Security Council is coming out with reports that ISIS-K is very much there, the Al-Qaeda is again there, Osama bin Laden's son is there meeting Taliban. So then all these 20 years, my question is, what did the Western troops, the Western forces do? You could not sanitize Afghanistan. You could not get rid of the terrorist organizations. Rather, you had ISIS-K also having their strong foothold there. So what exactly did you achieve? And now we have a situation where, as per the UNICEF itself, there are millions of children who are facing starvation. People are having to sell off their children. And it is, of course, and those reports cannot be questioned, because I've myself seen how some of the mothers there, the children, what abject poverty there is even in Kabul. I mean, you have just small pockets of, this rich elite places in Kabul. But if you go out on the roads, on the streets, you'll see this little young children, a whole bunch of them either selling boiled eggs or just giving you water bottles. And the moment they see a foreigner, they expect you to give them some dollars. I mean, it was a complete mess up at that point of time. However, I was made to believe that, Kabul will be this hugely secure place. It's a state-of-the-art city, that you will not, find anything, any nervousness there. But Kabul was very much unsafe. To even roam around, I remember my hotel person telling me that, do you want to book a cab from the hotel itself? If you do, we will advise you not to go for a bulletproof car, because then you will be more of a target with those magnetic bombs. So we'll tell you to, take a rundown kind of a cab. So yeah, I mean, I don't really want to talk about only my experiences, but that is where I can relate with Bette's book. When you go out, when you go to the villages, when you go to the provinces, you realize what you see as terrorism, or these uncouth people who are illiterate, who are not as sophisticated as you are. Maybe that's the way that they love to stay. I mean, for example, in Mazar-e-Sharif, I had this bunch of people sitting in Blue Mosque with me. They said that, okay, you would not, if you don't shoot a video or interview us, we'll tell you the truth. And they spoke the truth. And I don't know, maybe they were scared, but I don't think so. But then they did say that, Americans did not give us anything. Hamid Karzai did not give us anything. Ashraf Ghani, he is on his way out. They already knew that he will be leaving, which was kind of a prophecy. So what is it that we get? So let Taliban come in, let us see. At least they are part of us only. So, and I think that is also the advantage, probably to some extent, Pakistan took. But then I guess now they are also facing that problem, because the kind of influence that the Haqqani network is having there, the entire controversy around Durand Line. So nothing is sort of as straight-jacketed as the Western media had us believe. And the fact that I believe, at least from the neighborhood, from South Asia, I think more and more journalists should be going there and understand the society there. If people say that today the Taliban is, flogging women and forcing them to wear their traditional clothes, well, in Mazar, everybody, even before, I mean, I was there in Mazar just 2 days before Taliban sort of took over that place. Women were anyway covered. Even in Kabul, they all have their headscarves. They are not contesting all of that. But then the point is, when you talk about international recognition, what is it that you're actually wanting? Do you go and speak to the common Afghan and ask what is it that you want? Today, America has also frozen their assets of around $9.5 billion. But then what is the solution? What will you do? I mean, the more you alienate them, the more you will be losing the fact that the Taliban will not be accountable to you. So, I mean, that's my perspective.
I don't think that Taliban were accountable to the Americans even earlier. And I don't see how $9 billion is going to solve their problem. But since we are running out of time, I have one last question.
That'll help the economy.
It won't help the economy at all. It'll be watered down. It's like giving $9 billion to Pakistan. It'll just disappear. But I don't want to get into that debate. We can have that argument.
We can always, yeah.
But Bette, one last question, and then you can just wind it up, because we're just running out of time. And that question is on something which I've heard about Kabul called the Whiskey Boys of Kabul. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but there was this term which was very often used called the Whiskey Boys of Kabul, this elite crowd of local Kabuli fellows, well-educated in the US and others, who became the interface of, in a manner of speaking, of Afghanistan with the rest of the world. And these guys were quite cut off from the actual realities of what was happening in the provinces. Did you get that feeling? Because, you described the party scene in Kabul, which is exactly what I've heard of. I wish I was there to party out there like that, but that sounded rather interesting. But the fact of the matter is, purely politically, there was this sense that the people who were the interface with the international community, whether they were donor agencies, the embassies, what have you, were actually not people who actually knew what was happening in their own country. Did you get that sense while you were in Kabul?
I think there was an elite that indeed belonged to the government and also to parliamentarians sometimes. There were parliamentarians who were super rich, and there were people in the government who were super rich. So this is the outcome of this war on terror, where the Americans think that the country is a hell on earth, where you only can travel around with military protection, where every other Afghan is seen as a potential terrorist. And so where there is a complete dehumanization going on, which is neo-colonial almost, and sometimes racist. In that context, they found the government, which the Americans see as their only ally in this total insecurity, as they see it, which was not true. And so they elevated this elite rapidly. They tapped them on the shoulder and they said, you do what we want you to do. And we give you a lot of money for it, because the Americans considered Afghanistan so insecure that every salary was like 5 times higher if you would work for the Americans. And you cannot imagine what that has done with families and with indeed elites, not always in the government. And there's also very rich Taliban. There's just that money has had no effect for the people and has not improved health or education at all. But it did enrich a lot of players, including Americans. Don't forget that also for foreigners, it was very lucrative to jump in this war, because you easily made $10,000 a month, easily, if not more. If you would drum the war on terror beat and say Al-Qaeda is here and ISIS is here and look how dangerous it is, we need more money, that was easy. That is the most easy to sell narrative in the US. And that was corrupting the country totally. And so what I say also to the print is that by acting so neo-colonial and also so to refuse to listen to a more diverse set of sources, the chaos that was growing was a logic consequence of it, and it gave the Taliban the clout they jumped on. It was really Afghans after 9/11. Many, including Taliban, wanted a different country, and the Americans told them, we will offer you that. And it didn't happen. And the hope was gone. And instead, it was a very, like I said, there was like a situation where there was a lot of troops, and there was a lot of Afghans who were aligning with those troops who became criminals, because they got the freedom to kill whoever they wanted. Abdul Razak, for example, Jar Mohammed Khan, Asadullah Khalid, Gullah Shirzai, Sher Mohammed Akhundzadeh. You can endlessly name these people who killed their rivals with the help of the Americans. And those people, if they're still alive, are the rich ones. And the Taliban is back in power thanks to them. basically.
I think that's one of the lessons of history. War is good for business, and war is very big business. So I suppose Afghanistan proves that better than any other place. But thank you all. I really wish we had more time, because there was so much more to know from all of you. But that is it. We've just simply run out of time. And Betty, thanks a lot for a fabulous book. Anju Gupta, thanks for your intervention. And it's always good to have an alternate viewpoint while discussing something. Priyanka, as always, great to have you on board. And Nayanima, frankly, we would have been poorer off but for the dispatches you were sending from Kabul, because frankly, I'm sick of the same timelines, New York Times or Washington Post or what have you. And I really wish Indian newspapers would actually start sending people to get stories that matter to India, rather than being spoon-fed by what the Western media is feeding us and misleading us. Misleading us not only about our own country, but also about whichever other country they were. So thanks a lot for what you did out there. But this is where we must end. And Bette, great book. Looking forward to whatever next you're working on. Thanks a lot.